Hello everyone, welcome back to the class. So in today's video, I'm going to do a little bit of analysis based on A Bite of China episode 3, which you're going to watch for Wednesday. And the title is Inspiration of Change. Okay, so you can see, I think one of the most amazing food introduced in this episode is this hairy tofu. I myself never saw hairy tofu until I watched this episode. So I think maybe for you it is also one of the most exotic and strange food in this episode. So let's just do a very brief summary about the Chinese food mentioned in this episode. So first is tofu. Different kinds of tofu, actually a lot of different kinds of tofu. And the most exotic one, as I said, is the hairy one. And the second is milk, especially the dairy product made out of the milk. Especially, I think the introduced region is the Inner Mongolian, so the northern part of China, which there's a lot of people still doing the Norman and raise their own sheep, their own cow, and have their own milk to make dairy products. The third one is soy sauce. And I think it's very interesting if you compare this way of shooting soy sauce to Li Ziqi's way of introducing and making soy sauce, and how that will be different. The last one is the yellow wine. So I think one of the most interesting feature all these materials or all these foods share is that they had a change of status. For example, from liquid to solid, or from very tender to very stiff. So there's a very distinctive change of texture in all these different kinds of food. And that is why they mean by the change. There's some takeaway from this episode. The first is that the food always amazes me in ways we never expected, like how they are able to change and how they are able to be invented. And second is that how Chinese people are in charge of food, made best use of natural materials and tailor the food to suit their needs. I think it also connects to the idea of how Chinese culture is expressed in these kind of various kinds of food. So, the first thing I want to talk about is that when we feel amazed by the food, what exactly are we amazed about? I think when we use the word amazed, a lot of times when you're watching not only this kind of episode, but maybe like cooking videos, or kind of not only cooking, but like making something out of from the scratch, making something out of nowhere, that kind of video on YouTube, we are actually praising the impossible. So especially for this episode, that is how chemistry works to change the form of food, like when you ferment a wine, how the grain changes to liquid to the wine, how a lot of different kinds of fungi and other things works to make the wine. So those kind of chemical change is one of the impossible we will never actually thinking about when we consume the food. So, but it is there in the making process, and when we actually pay attention to the making process, that is the fact that amazes us. And second, I will say it is a human technique of making food. So just as I said, you will never imagine how Chinese people can make out of one simple ingredients like the milk. So the technique itself amazes us. And also, I think the unusual display of food is also kind of have the shocking value, especially when you're looking at the visual, like a video. The display itself means a lot. I will talk about that later, but thinking about this picture, this is when they kind of try to dry the milk and bound it on a wooden stick and to dry the milk. And it's kind of like the bear, windy bear hanging there. So that special angle amazes us. And I think my question will be, are these food representative as Chinese food? I think this question is very debatable, depend on what's your imagination or what's your definition of Chinese food, and it kind of depends on where you come from and which region you belong to and which region you identify yourself as. But at least this kind of amazing effect has been successfully achieved by representing the chemical work in the process of making food, the human technique, and the on Euro display. And also, let's thinking about the audience. Who is the target audience of this whole series? Now we watched 2 episodes and we kind of roughly get the idea of what the director want to represent. So for Chinese, actually all these food, especially the making of milk and the hairy tofu, as I said, I'm so surprised tofu can be that way and still can be able to be eaten. Because we already thinking about when food grow hair on them, they are going bad. But those kind of hairy tofu is intentionally made that way. So I think for Chinese, especially this episode, is try to defamiliarize their idea about food and kind of creating that amazing effect by this kind of defamiliarization. And for non-Chinese audience, I think the defamiliarization effect is still there, but also kind of there's another layer of exoticize. So when you're thinking about hairy tofu, it's so exotic and so out of the world, but it is there in China. So you kind of make it a spectacle and gaze upon it and feel amazed about it. So I would define this process as exoticize. So let's take a look at several frames I think is very representative of this kind of defamiliarization effect and also create some sort of fantasy when we're thinking about Chinese food. So for example, this one, as I said, this is one of the form of milk you will never imagine because you're thinking about milk, you're thinking about something very liquid and something you can easily, something white, something very savory and you can easily consume by drinking. But now they want to represent to you like there's another form of milk that can be bounded on wooden sticks and hanging there. And also pay attention to this light. The light kind of shines through all these wooden sticks and this kind of angle is like you look up to them and makes the food much bigger than it would be, that kind of effect. And not only bigger, but also has a feeling of sacred or something higher. So I think this angle really performs well for the intention of defamiliarization and also creating fantasy. And also this screenshot is from when the episode is introducing the yellow wine. This is actually the rim of the wine bottle. But they try to, I think this is very similar. So let the light peek through, and which is an angle not very familiar in daily life. When we see this in this episode, we feel like we have some distance with that food, but we know it is what it is. So we are still know like this food is what I know, but now I'm not so sure whether I actually know it. That kind of effect is what I'm talking about, like defamiliarization. And the third one is talking about the duck. I think it's very familiar too. You see the light peeks through and the duck is hanging there and the camera is taking like when you are looking up to the ducks. So that kind of angle, I think it's kind of a signature angle, a camera angle for this series. And one more thing to pay attention to is that how this series actually present the contrast between fantasy and reality. Actually, I think in this episode, they mentioned in the big cities, people always thinking about all the the Norman, the people living in the Mongolia, they are so close to all these sheep, goat, lamb, so they will enjoy. They have more chances to enjoy the grilled lamb. But that is actually a fantasy for the big city restaurants and big city residents, because this episode told us the Normans actually raising their own goat, and they are so precious. So they don't often have the grilled lamb as a daily cuisine, but they will have their milk instead. So milk became their main menu. So by making this kind of contrast, I think this episode has a very strong intent to create a kind of new fantasy. That is to try to shape the way you imagine and understand Chinese food as, I will say, homemade, personalized, and well crafted. As in this example, you'll see she will say, this episode is saying like, people at their home make their own food and make connection with the food themselves, which is different from what we see in the big restaurant. So there's a judgment. The big restaurant fantasy is wrong or incorrect, but this real life way of living with the food, with milk, is right. But when we're thinking about, I think someone mentioned in the forum, actually a lot of food these days, even Chinese food, are mass production. But this episode, as well as Li Ziqi's video, promote so much on the homemade food and the family workshop. So they kind of create a new fantasy. Only the homemade, only the family workshop can produce the most authentic Chinese food. So you should be aware of how their intent is guiding us to thinking about Chinese food or to understand Chinese food. And a little bit more about the cultural perspective. I think this episode also tried to tackle the question of how food and Chinese history or philosophy connected, and how to make food a culture. Especially when you're thinking about the title, the inspiration of change, it so easily, especially the English title, so easily reminds us of the Book of Change, the very famous Chinese classic. Is talking about. I put the picture here, like the trigrams, and how the 5 elements change to each other and always stay constant, stay in harmony. All this philosophical idea is embedded in the title, the inspiration of change, and what does it mean by change. But I also want you to pay attention to some details in the voiceover that needs a close reading. So for example, when the person is talking about the invention of tofu, he said, with great flexibility, tofu offered a huge space for the imagination of the Chinese. And so the disadvantages of soybeans were eliminated by reason or unconsciously as the ancient Chinese transformed soybean into tofu. And he continues with Chinese cook, or Chinese are showing their adaptability. So do you think there is some sort of overgeneralization? Because the voiceover repeatedly saying, oh, this is Chinese food, this is Asian China. But he never pinned down the time period and the context. We never know, like, Asian China, but which period, which year? Chinese, but which region, who? This kind of overgeneralization is everywhere in this episode and actually in this series. And I will say, on the one hand, you want to promote a nation's culture, you need to offer a punch and make an impact. So maybe overly generalization is not avoidable, but still thinking about this episode is made by the Chinese government as some sort of propaganda. So this kind of too general idea about China and Chinese food will cast some doubt from the viewers, like whether that is Chinese and what exactly, which part of China, what culture are you talking about? And also, I think one most important feature of this whole series is they always want to connect food with the merits of Chinese people. So, for example, when they talking about again tofu, so despite its plainness, Chinese tofu is given a special spiritual quality. The Asian people praise it and say tofu has merits. Those who have tofu are content with a simple life. Those who make tofu understand it's best to let life take its own course. I think this connection is made very cleverly. Like the making of tofu represents the idea of change and represents the attitude of Chinese people. That logic is valid. And also thinking about this complementary image when saying this voiceover, it looks like what? A lotus, right? So your mind is setting to receive that information of Chinese people being content of life, like doing Buddhist cultivation and enjoy the lotus like tofu or lotus like food. But I mean, sometimes you should step back a little bit and thinking about how much is too much when we read into food. Can food actually represent culture or merit? And I think it is always good to cast a little bit doubt onto the representational work in front of your eyes, like in this TV series or in other videos we are going to read. They try to guide you to think one way, but maybe sometimes you can ask yourself, is that really like that? Is the food really that prominently represent some sort of merits? Is a connection there? I think this kind of critical attitude is very helpful when you're doing your close reading on any sort of representational work, like movies or novels or things like that. Okay, so that's all for my interpretation of this TV series of this episode. I hope you enjoyed it, and don't forget to leave your comments. Whatever you thought about hearing this whole lecture video in the comment section, and also I'll see you on Friday to discuss all about A Bite of China. Okay, thank you and see you on Friday. Bye.